What if a single glance at a tattoo, a small act of ridicule from a man who crushed businesses for breakfast, ignited a chain reaction that shattered decades of criminal immunity in one heartbeat? When Tasha merely turned to face the sneering Mafia Don in that crowded diner, nobody expected his own bodyguards to draw their weapons against him. The mark on her skin, concealed beneath her uniform until that pivotal moment, wasn't just decoration, but a symbol that transformed an ordinary server into the most dangerous person in his blood-soaked empire. Tasha Carson wiped sweat from her brow as she balanced 3 plates along her forearm, a skill perfected through 8 years of service at the Bluebird Diner, where the linoleum floors had long since faded to a jaundiced yellow, and the ceiling fans spun so slowly they merely circulated the stale air. The weight of the plates was nothing compared to the burden of unpaid medical bills that multiplied each month as her 10-year-old son Eli fought a rare blood disorder, treatments costing more than she made in 6 months at this job, where her tip jar rarely contained more than coins and crumpled singles. Rain lashed against the foggy windows of the diner, creating rivulets that distorted the red neon sign flickering outside, the weather keeping most customers away except for the few regulars who had nowhere else to go. The bell above the door jingled, cutting through the clatter of silverware and murmur of subdued conversations, and the entire atmosphere of the diner instantly transformed as Manager Pete rushed from behind the counter, his face flushing red as he hissed urgent instructions to the staff. Heads lowered, shoulders hunched, and voices quieted as Don Vito Caruso strode in with 4 large men flanking him, their tailored suits and confident postures marking them as different from the worn-down neighborhood residents who usually populated the vinyl booths. Pete had drilled the rules into every employee from their first day. When Caruso comes in, he gets the corner booth regardless of who is sitting there. His coffee arrives within 30 seconds. His orders take priority over every other customer, and most importantly, no one makes eye contact or speaks unless spoken to first. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting harsh shadows across the faces of patrons who suddenly found intense interest in their meals. The erratic lighting revealing glimpses of fear in their downcast eyes and tense jaws as conversations died to whispers. Tasha felt her stomach clench as Pete frantically motioned her toward their section, her trembling hands betraying the calm facade she fought to maintain. Knowing there's a single mistake in serving the man who controlled every business, apartment building and street corner in this part of the city could cost her the job she desperately needed. The very air seemed to thicken with tension as Don Vito settled into his seat, casually draping his Italian leather coat over the booth while his bodyguards positioned themselves strategically around him, their suit jackets unbuttoned for easy access to the weapons Tasha pretended not to notice pressing against the fabric. As she approached their table with practiced deference, notepad ready and eyes appropriately lowered, Tasha recognized her own existence mirrored in the atmosphere of fearful servitude that had descended upon the diner, both of them trapped in a world controlled by men who took what they wanted without consequence. Friends, before we go further, may I ask a small favor? Please subscribe to our channel, it truly helps us keep bringing you these stories, and reaching 1,000 subscribers soon is so important for us to continue. We also love hearing from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how our little storytelling circle is spreading across the world. And if you enjoyed the beginning, give this video a like and let's share thoughts on the whole story together below. The water pitcher trembled slightly in Tasha's grip as she leaned between 2 bodyguards to refill Don Vito's glass, the cuff of her uniform sleeve riding up just enough to reveal the edge of an intricate tattoo spiraling around her wrist, a memento from a life she thought long buried under years of struggle and sacrifice. The ice clinked against crystal as a small splash escaped over the rim, nothing more than a few drops that purled harmlessly on the polished tabletop, but Don Vito reacted as if she had emptied the entire pitcher onto his imported suit, pulling back with exaggerated disgust while his cold eyes locked onto the exposed ink on her skin. His thick lips curled into a smirk as he jabbed one bejeweled finger toward her wrist, drawing his companion's attention with a theatrical gesture that sent Tasha scrambling to tug her sleeve down. But the damage was already done as his voice rose deliberately to fill the suddenly silent diner. The words flowed like poison from his mouth, jokes about trash marking the Vera bodies because they had nothing else of value, comments about how desperate people brand themselves like cattle, laughing about how she probably got it in exchange for favors in some back-alley shop from an artist as worthless as herself. Each syllable landed like a physical blow as Tasha stood frozen beside the table, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder, her face carefully blank despite the scorching humiliation that crawled up her neck and the cold rage building in her chest, coiling like a serpent with nowhere to strike. Around the diner, patrons developed sudden fascinations with their meals, stirring coffee that needed no stirring, rearranging silverware in perfect alignment, their averted gazes and hunched postures silently acknowledging that interference would only redirect Vito's cruelty toward themselves, their cowardice a rational response to the raw power dynamics playing. Out before them, one of the bodyguards snickered on cue, another adding his own crude observation about what other parts of her body might be marked, the men performing their expected roles in this theatre of cruelty, while Tasha stood immobilized by the invisible shackles of economic necessity, each second of his continuing mockery a reminder that people like her existed to be used and discarded at the whims of men like him. Her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly against the pitcher handle, knuckles whitening with the effort of restraint, years of practiced stoicism warring against the primal urge to fling the ice water into his smug face, to scream truths about parasites who built nothing yet claimed everything, to reclaim some shred of dignity even at the cost of everything else. But Eli needed his medication. Their apartment rent was due in 3 days, and manager Pete was watching with undisguised panic from behind the counter. So Tasha swallowed the bitter pill of powerlessness, murmured a quiet apology that tasted like ash on her tongue, and continued pouring water with mechanical precision. While Don Vito finally tired of his sport and returned to discussing business with his associates, her humanity dismissed as casually as one might wave away an annoying insect, her trembling rage contained like so many flames before it, fueling the desperate hope that someday things would change. The narrow back alley behind the Bluebird Diner offered little respite from the day, smelling of wet cardboard and fryer grease. But Tasha welcomed the 10 precious minutes of solitude as she leaned against the brick wall, flexing her aching feet and watching raindrops create tiny craters in puddles reflecting the grey sky above. Her break had barely begun when the metal door creaked open and Mr. Sullivan shuffled out, his weathered face crumpling with embarrassment, as he explained in a voice thin as tissue paper that his insurance had denied another claim, leaving him short for even his modest meal of toast and eggs. Tasha noticed how his once elegant suit hung from his diminished frame, frayed cuffs carefully mended with nearly invisible stitches, the dignity in his posture at odds with the tremor in his liver-spotted hands as he offered to leave his watch as collateral until Social Security arrived next week. Without hesitation, Tasha pressed her last $20 bill into his palm, waving away his protests with reassurances that the money meant nothing compared to his company, though the truth stung like the cigarette burns dotting the dumpster beside them. Those dollars had been earmarked for gas to drive Eli to his clinic appointment tomorrow. Gratitude shimmered in Mr. Sullivan's watery blue eyes as he settled beside her on an overturned milk crate, their shared silence comfortable until he nodded toward the diner and mentioned he had seen how Caruso treated her, his soft voice hardening with a familiar authority that seemed to momentarily straighten his curved spine. Rain pattered against the rusted fire escape above them as Mr. Sullivan revealed fragments of his past life, words spilling forth as if long contained behind a crumbling dam, tales of courtrooms and legal briefs, of a career spent prosecuting organized crime, until a mysterious illness struck suddenly 5 years ago, symptoms matching textbook poisoning though nothing could be proven. Tasha listened with widening eyes as he described losing everything to medical bills, his pension mysteriously tied up in administrative problems, his colleagues gradually distancing themselves as his cases were reassigned and eventually dismissed, including a major RICO investigation against the Caruso family that had been years in the making. Steam billowed from a vent near their feet, wreathing their figures in gossamer white as Mr. Sullivan studied her face with unexpected intensity, noting that in 15 years of pursuing the Carusos, he had seen that distinctive tattoo pattern only once before, on documents seized from a rival family long thought extinct. His gnarled fingers lightly tapped his temple as he shared that, though his body had weakened, his mind remained sharp as ever, along with a lifetime of evidence carefully hidden away, information that might interest someone with reason to challenge the current power structure, the implication hanging between them like the moisture in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Their unlikely alliance forming in that grimy alley seemed as inconsequential as 2 raindrops merging on the cracked pavement, yet contained within it the first molecules of a gathering storm that neither fully comprehended As manager, Pete bellowed for Tasha to return, her brief respite ending with the harsh clang of the metal door as she hurried back to her duties, Mr. Sullivan watching thoughtfully as she disappeared inside. The apple pie a la mode melted slowly on the dessert plates Tasha carried toward the corner booth, the vanilla ice cream transforming into sweet rivulets around the cinnamon-spiced filling, as Don Vito continued his business discussion, his voice deliberately projected to ensure his power was acknowledged by everyone within earshot. Her steps faltered as she caught fragments of his plans to empty the Parkview apartments by month-end, raising rents beyond possibility for current tenants, the same building where Eli's best friend Jamie lived with his grandmother, who worked 2 jobs cleaning office buildings after dark. Rage fluttered beneath her ribcage like a trapped bird as Vito detailed how he would convert the affordable housing into luxury condominiums, laughing about the neighborhood trash being cleared out, his gold rings catching the fluorescent light as he gestured expansively about progress and revitalization, while describing families being scattered like unwanted debris. As Tasha carefully arranged the desserts before each man, Vito paused mid-sentence, his attention returning to her like a predator noticing wounded prey, his earlier mockery apparently insufficient to satisfy his appetite for cruelty. Cold eyes fixated again on her partially visible tattoo as he resumed his commentary on Mark Trash, asking his associates if they thought she had others hidden elsewhere, suggesting to the youngest bodyguard that perhaps he should find out. The men chuckling on command like puppets jerked by invisible strings. Something ancient and immovable crystallized in Tasha's core as 20 years of endured humiliations swallowed pride and suppressed rage suddenly compressed into diamond-hard resolve, the pressure behind her eyes transforming from frustrated tears into clear-eyed purpose, with deliberate slowness. She placed the final dessert plate before Vito, then straightened to her full height, a subtle but unmistakable change in her bearing, silencing his voice mid-taunt as she methodically rolled up her sleeve, fully exposing the intricate tattoo that spiraled from her wrist upward, an ancient family crest rendered in deep blue ink that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning in the flickering light. The oldest bodyguard, Marco, glanced at her arm with the automatic disdain expected of him, then froze completely, his weathered face draining of colour as his eyes darted between her tattoo and the heavy signet ring adorning his own right hand, the matching insignia unmistakable despite decades of secrecy. Recognition travelled through the room like an electric current, first Marco, then the other bodyguards whose hands moved not toward Tasha but to their concealed weapons, tension gathering in the air like the stillness before lightning strikes. Don Vito's confidence faltered visibly as he registered the sudden shift, confusion giving way to dawning horror as he studied Tasha's face with new awareness, finally seeing the bone structure and eyes that connected her to ghosts from his past, the resemblance revealing itself like a photograph developing in caustic chemicals. The clatter of forks against plates ceased throughout the diner as the atmosphere crystallized into something dangerous and volatile, history and bloodlines asserting themselves through the simple act of a waitress turning toward her tormentor, the insignia of the long-feared Savona family, resurrected in the most unexpected vessel imaginable. Time compressed into crystalline fragments as 4 guns materialized simultaneously, their barrels pointing not at Tasha but at Don Vito himself, the bodyguards abandoning their employer to form a protective circle around the waitress still holding an empty serving tray, their movements synchronized with practiced precision that spoke of years of disciplined preparation for this exact moment. Marco, silver-haired with a face mapped by decades of violence, dropped to one knee before Tasha, his weathered hand reaching for hers with trembling reverence, his voice thick with an accent long suppressed as he whispered, La Filia, with the fearful respect reserved for royalty or divine apparition, a title that transformed the diner waitress into something both hallowed and terrifying in a single breath. Chaos erupted across the diner as customers processed the meaning behind drawn weapons, scrambling from booths and abandoning half-eaten meals, wallets forgotten, and purses dropped in their desperate exodus toward exits suddenly too narrow for the panic-hood crowd, their flight instinct overwhelming any curiosity about the drama unfolding in the corner booth. Don Vito remained unnaturally still amidst the pandemonium, his face draining of blood until his olive complexion faded to the sickly pallor of old wax, pupils dilating with recognition as his gaze traced features in Tasha's face that had been invisible to him minutes before, the high cheekbones and particular tilt of dark eyes that belonged to a ghost from 20 years past, a woman he had personally ensured would never again walk this earth. The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken history as realization dawned in his eyes, his gaze darting between her face and the tattoo now fully visible on her arm. The signet that by all rights should have died with the Savona bloodline, he believed thoroughly extinguished through fire and blood on that rain-soaked night decades ago when he consolidated his power. Manager Pete cowered behind the counter, his authority evaporated like morning dew, while the short-order cook gripped a spatula with white knuckles, frozen between fight and flight as the power that had governed their world inverted itself before their eyes. A cosmic reversal that transformed their invisible colleague into the gravitational center of a new reality. The red vinyl booth that had always been Vito's throne now became his trap, the cushioned seat suddenly precarious as his own soldiers turned against him with cold efficiency, the guards who had laughed at his jokes and enforced his will, now standing at attention before a woman in a stained waitress uniform whose spine had straightened imperceptibly, her shoulders squaring as if shrugging off years of deliberate invisibility, her fingertips lightly touching the familiar pattern on her skin, as if confirming its power was not merely symbolic but dangerously tangible. Rain continued to streak down windows now emptied of observers, the storm outside nothing compared to the tempest brewing within as centuries of vendettas, blood oaths, and family loyalties reasserted themselves through veins that had never forgotten their origin, despite the bearer herself having been kept ignorant of the legacy flowing beneath her skin. A birthright about to rewrite the rules that had governed her existence since the day she entered this neighborhood, believing herself to be nothing more than another struggling single mother. The sleek black sedan glided through rain-slicked streets, Marcos' grim silence beside her in the back seat, a stark contrast to the urgent phone calls he made, in rapid Italian, each word carrying weight Tasha could feel though not understand as buildings transformed from crumbling facades to gleaming glass towers outside her window. The elevator rose 80 floors without stopping, mirrored walls reflecting Tasha's dishevelled appearance still in her waitress uniform, ketchup stain visible on one sleeve, her confusion growing with each passing floor as Marco stood at rigid attention, his eyes forward but his body angled protectively toward her, in a posture of deference that contradicted everything she knew about power and position in the world. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors when elevator doors opened directly into a penthouse foyer, the space larger than Tasha's entire apartment, with soaring ceilings adorned with hand-painted frescoes and walls lined with original artwork, whose value she could only guess at from the ornate frames and museum-quality lighting. Marco guided her past an antique grandfather clock worth more than she earned in a year, through rooms where silk draperies and leather-bound books spoke of old money and older secrets, until they reached a terrace garden, enclosed in glass where the city sprawled below like a jewelled tapestry, the same streets Tasha had walked in worn sneakers now reduced to glittering arteries viewed from impossible height. An elderly woman stood waiting among exotic orchids and small citrus trees, her silver hair elegantly coiffed, her posture regal despite the carved ebony cane supporting her weight, her tailored silk suit speaking of wealth so assured it needed no ostentation, her eyes the exact shape and colour as Tasha's own. Time seemed suspended as the woman studied Tasha's face with unconcealed hunger, tears gathering in those familiar eyes as she opened her arms in a gesture so primally recognizable that Tasha moved forward without conscious thought, embraced by arms surprisingly strong for their apparent fragility, enveloped in expensive perfume that triggered impossible memory fragments from earliest childhood. Donna Elisa Savona whispered against Tasha's hair in a voice rough with emotion and cigarettes, naming herself grandmother, blood of her blood, keeper of secrets and vengeance, words flowing like wine as she explained how the Savona family had not been destroyed as the world believed, but had retreated into shadow when Tasha's parents were murdered, how the tattoo had been insurance against a day when fate might bring Tasha into danger, how every movement of her life had been watched from afar by loyal soldiers awaiting this moment of revelation. Questions tangled in Tasha's throat as she struggled to reconcile her lifetime of hardship with the wealth surrounding her. The years of double shifts and denied medications with the resources evident in every surface of this palace in the sky. Her mind battling between anger at being abandoned to struggle and wonder at this hidden world suddenly laid at her feet like an inheritance she never knew existed. Rain pattered against the glass ceiling above them as Donna Elisa gently traced the tattoo on Tasha's arm, explaining its significance as the true family crest, not just decoration but declaration of birthright, the ink a silent sentinel that had finally fulfilled its purpose by revealing her to those sworn to protect the last Savona bloodline when danger presented itself in the form of their oldest enemy. Crystal stemware clinked softly as Donna Elisa poured amber liquid into 2 glasses, her arthritic fingers adorned with rings that caught the warm light of antique lamps, her movements deliberate as she arranged herself on a velvet settee and motioned for Tasha to join her beneath an oil painting of the Sicilian coastline. The story spilled forth like the aged brandy, how Antonio Savona had fallen hopelessly in love with Catherine Reynolds, an American art student in Florence, their romance defying family expectations and business arrangements, including a proposed alliance marriage to the Caruso family that would have united territories and ended generations of rivalry. Photographs emerged from a lacquered box as Donna Elisa spoke, images of a handsome couple cradling an infant Tasha, their eyes bright with the same defiance that now surged through her veins as she recognized her own features distributed between their smiling faces, concrete proof of a history she had been told was lost in a car accident. The truth flowed dark and bitter as Donna Elisa described the night Vito Caruso orchestrated their murders, his wounded pride and rejected overtures to Catherine transforming into obsessive hatred, the bodies found in their burning home while 3-year-old Tasha had been safely hidden with a babysitter miles away. Tears streaked silently down leathery cheeks as the elderly woman explained how the family had to vanish completely, enemies believing the entire Savona line eradicated, while loyal soldiers were positioned strategically within Caruso's organization, waiting years for the moment of restoration, the tattoo a brilliant safeguard designed by Donna Elisa herself as a recognition signal should Tasha ever encounter danger. Rage and confusion battled for dominance in Tasha's chest as she processed 20 years of unnecessary poverty and struggle, her son's untreated illness, the countless humiliations endured while family wealth sat unused in gleaming towers, her fingers trembling as she lifted a silver frame containing a photo of her parents' wedding day, the happiness frozen in time a cruel contrast to the life she had actually lived. Questions burst from her lips like water through broken concrete, demanding explanations for her abandonment to foster care, for the distance maintained when Eli fell ill, for the years of watching from shadows while she worked herself to exhaustion, her anger punctuated by the distant wail of sirens from the city below as Donna Elisa accepted each accusation with dignified acknowledgement. Explanations came with neither excuse nor apology, how enemies watched orphanages for claimed children, how contact would have drawn assassins to her door, how her ordinary life provided protection that wealth could not guarantee, how Vito's obsession with finding any remaining Savona blood had never faded. His networks of informants searching for a child who might have survived that night of flames. Family history unfolded through more photographs and heirlooms, generations of power and tradition condensed into stories that rewrote Tasha's understanding of herself, each revelation connecting her to a legacy of influence that existed alongside the criminal enterprise, a complex heritage of both blood spilled and communities protected, of vengeance and honor entwined like the very pattern inked permanently upon her skin. Crystal decanters clinked against tumbler glass as Don Vito poured his 3rd scotch in 30 minutes, amber liquid splashing over the rim and onto the polished surface of his mahogany desk where financial ledgers lay forgotten, beside a half-eaten meal, his unsteady hand betraying the fear he struggled to conceal from the 5 captains gathered in his private office. Rain continued its relentless assault on floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he had controlled for 2 decades, droplets racing down glass like tears as he recounted the impossible appearance of the Savona tattoo on a waitress he had carelessly mocked. The recognition in Marcos' eyes confirming his worst nightmare had somehow materialized in flesh and blood after years of believing the bloodline extinguished. Security footage from the diner played on a mounted television screen, images of his own bodyguards forming a protective circle around the waitress, replaying in silent betrayal as the captains shifted uncomfortably in leather chairs, exchanging glances heavy with unspoken calculations about where true power now resided in the rapidly changing landscape. Sweat beaded on Vito's forehead despite the room's careful climate control, his collar suddenly too tight as he loosened his silk tie and revealed how Donna Elisa Savona, long presumed dead, had apparently preserved not only her life but her granddaughter, the child he thought had perished in flames alongside Antonio and Catherine, his voice cracking when he mentioned the mother, whose rejection 2 decades ago still burned like acid in his gut. Family photographs lined the bookshelves behind him, carefully staged images of power and respectability that seemed to watch with disappointment as he gulped more scotch. His facade of invincible authority visibly crumbling with each reference to the Savona matriarch, whose strategic brilliance had once forced his own father to cede territory rather than face complete destruction. The crystal stopper fell from the decanter and rolled across imported carpet as Vito slammed his fist against wood, demanding immediate action before the girl could fully claim her heritage, ordering her elimination along with her sickly son, whose medical records were already spread across the desk, surveillance photos revealing a thin boy with his mother's eyes attached with paper clips, target information compiled with clinical efficiency by organizations now compromised by unknown loyalties. Decades of carefully cultivated respect withered visibly as Vito rambled about old vendettas and personal slights, about the woman who had chosen love over his proposal, about bloodlines and territories and ancient rights, his captains witnessing the unraveling of mythology in real time as their untouchable leader descended into increasingly desperate bargaining, offering increased percentages and exclusive territories in exchange for unwavering loyalty in the coming conflict. Glass shattered against walnut paneling as Vito hurled his empty tumbler in sudden rage, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth as he detailed the gruesome specifics of how the waitress and her son should suffer before dying, his orders escalating in savagery proportional to the fear evident in his trembling hands and sweat-stained shirt. The vulnerability beneath his expensive suit exposed like raw nerve to men who respected only strength, their silent assessments of his weakness more dangerous than any external threat that had come before. Morning light filtered weakly through blinds in Donna Elisa's guest bedroom as Tasha paced across plush carpet, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar silk of borrowed nightclothes, while adamantly refusing the legacy presented to her, insisting she wanted no part of criminal enterprises regardless of family history, her voice rising with each declaration that she would take her son and disappear rather than step into a world built on extortion and violence. The buzzing phone interrupted her protests, hospital numbers flashing across the screen shattering her moral certainty, with news that Eli had been rushed to emergency care after collapsing at school, his condition deteriorating beyond the usual symptoms, fear instantly replacing righteous indignation as she flew through marble hallways still wearing the silk pajamas, Marco materializing with keys and a waiting car that cut through morning traffic with disregard for laws or lights. Fluorescent bulbs cast sickly shadows across institutional green walls as Tasha raced through hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and desperation, the beeping monitors and hushed medical terminology creating a backdrop of organized chaos as she found her son connected to more machines than she had ever seen. His small frame diminished against white sheets, skin translucent enough to trace blue veins beneath the surface. Medical terms washed over her in waves of incomprehensible threat. Severe aplastic anemia progressing to critical levels, platelets dangerously low, infection risk extreme, standard treatments proving insufficient as doctors in white coats with clipboard authority-delivered prognoses. Prognoses measured in weeks rather than years, their carefully neutral expressions portraying the hopelessness they professionally concealed. Marcos' presence remained constant at the edge of her awareness, his military posture softening only when he finally approached during a moment alone with her unconscious son, reluctantly revealing information that fractured her world further, explaining how Vito Caruso had systematically used influence to block Ellis acceptance into experimental treatment programs, showing promise for exactly his condition, how applications had mysteriously disappeared, how specialists suddenly became unavailable, how insurance appeals were routinely denied through boards where Caruso's silent partners held positions, the systematic campaign of interference designed to maintain control through vulnerability, rather than from any personal animosity. Cold fury crystallized in Tasha's chest as she processed this deliberate endangerment of her child, maternal instinct colliding violently with ethical principles as she watched each labored breath her son took. The moral high ground she had claimed hours earlier, suddenly seeming an indulgent luxury when weighed against the immediate threat to the person she loved most in the world. Conflict raged behind her eyes as she stood suspended between worlds, the principled rejection of criminal power now directly opposed to accessing resources that might save her child, her trembling fingers brushing damp hair from Ellis' forehead as machines continued their rhythmic monitoring of failing systems, the sterile hospital room becoming the battlefield where abstract morality faced the concrete reality of potential loss, her internal struggle visible only in the tightening of her jaw and the tears she refused to let fall as she contemplated choices no mother should ever have to make. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes against linoleum announced Mr. Sullivan before he appeared in the hospital doorway, his frail frame supported by an aluminum walker that seemed barely substantial enough to bear even his diminished weight. Yet determination burned in eyes that suddenly appeared sharper than Tasha had ever noticed during his regular visits to the diner. He shuffled toward Ellis' bedside with painful slowness, his laboured breathing matching the rhythm of the oxygen machine helping her son, his weathered hand reaching out to briefly touch the boy's pale fingers before turning his attention to Tasha with newfound urgency and purpose that transformed his stooped posture. Words tumbled forth in a hushed torrent as he explained his true identity, not simply a former prosecutor, but the lead investigator on a specialized task force assembled specifically to dismantle Vito Caruso's criminal enterprise, his current physical deterioration, the direct result of thallium poisoning administered during a celebration dinner the night before he was scheduled to present evidence to a grand jury. Rain streaked down windows as Sullivan described his painstaking documentation of every transaction, property acquisition, bribery arrangement, and violent act ordered by Vito over 15 years, records preserved despite multiple break-ins at his office and mysterious computer failures, evidence secured through methods learned from prosecuting similar organizations where survival depended on redundancy and misdirection. An hour later, Tasha stood speechless in Sullivan's modest apartment 10 blocks from the hospital, surrounded by what initially appeared to be the cluttered home of an elderly hoarder, but revealed itself as meticulously organized case files, disguised as mundane paperwork, hidden in plain sight among shopping receipts and junk mail, financial records secured inside hollowed books, witness statements coded within crossword puzzles, and surveillance photographs concealed behind generic landscape prints on water-stained walls. Each manila folder Sullivan extracted from hiding places revealed another facet of Vito's corruption, the systematic documentation of shell companies purchasing nursing homes where Medicare fraud flourished, of building inspectors bribed to overlook violations in tenements, while luxury properties received preferential treatment, of judges whose gambling debts created convenient leverage, all connected through financial trails that Sullivan had followed with religious devotion despite his deteriorating health. Hope flickered in Tasha's chest as she realized the power contained in these innocuous papers, a legitimate path to justice that required no bloodshed or assumption of criminal authority, a way to save her son without sacrificing her soul in the process, the possibility of destroying Vito through the very legal system he had corrupted, rather than replacing him within the underworld hierarchy her grandmother expected her to command. Internal conflict played across her features as Sullivan pressed a USB drive into her palm, explaining it contained encrypted copies of everything needed to initiate RICO proceedings that would freeze Vito's assets and dismantle his protection network, offering a third option between embracing the Savona legacy of violence or fleeing with her son, a choice that honored both her parents' love story and her own moral boundaries while still securing the resources Eli desperately needed for treatment. The first bullet shattered the nurse's station glass precisely 4 minutes after Tasha had left Ellis' room to speak with his doctor, the sound reverberating through sterile corridors like thunder as patients and medical staff scattered in blind panic amid suddenly blaring emergency alarms. Fluorescent lights reflected off stainless steel as 3 men in maintenance uniforms moved methodically through the pediatric ward, silenced weapons concealed beneath clipboards, while they checked room numbers against information provided by hospital insiders on Vito's payroll. Their target, the fragile boy, whose existence now threatened their employers' 2 decades of carefully constructed power. Maternal instinct collided with something ancient and predatory in Tasha's blood as she sprinted back toward her son's room, processing the tactical situation with a clarity that seemed to slow time around her, her mind instantly cataloguing exit routes, improvised weapons, and defensive positions with an intuitive understanding that had never manifested in her conscious life before this moment of existential threat. Marco moved to shield her with his body, but found himself instead following her rapid commands as she directed patients into secure rooms, instructed nurses on barricade materials, and identified the emergency stairwell access points the attackers would likely use, her decisiveness drawing immediate compliance from hospital staff who recognized authentic authority even in blood-spattered scrubs she had grabbed from a supply cart. Cold precision replaced fear as Tasha orchestrated an evacuation of vulnerable patients, while simultaneously positioning Marcos men at strategic choke points, her fingers flying across the hospital security panel to initiate emergency lockdown procedures on specific floors rather than the entire facility, creating controlled chaos that would funnel the attackers into predetermined areas while allowing first responders clear access to other sections. Gunfire echoed against tile as Tasha reached Ellis' room seconds before the assassins, her hands never trembling as she disconnected his essential monitors with perfect knowledge of which alarms could be safely bypassed and which required immediate portable alternatives, transferring her semi-conscious son to a gurney with gentle efficiency while simultaneously directing two of Marcos' men to create a diversion 3 rooms down. The complex assault unfolded according to plans laid generations before Tasha's birth, her body remembering strategies her conscious mind had never learned, bloodline asserting itself through muscles and neurons that responded to crisis with the fluid grace of inherited instinct, her every movement demonstrating the leadership capacity that had flowed unrecognized beneath her waitress uniform. Donna Elisa observed from the shadowed doorway of an empty patient room, approval glimmering in ancient eyes as she witnessed her granddaughter's transformation from reluctant heir to natural commander, the emergency revealing what peaceful circumstances could not, the true Savona temperament emerging under pressure like a sword forged in necessary fire. The genetic memory of countless strategic battles surfacing through blood that recognized its purpose in crisis, validating every sacrifice made to preserve this bloodline when lesser alternatives presented themselves. Candlelight flickered against stone walls carved with family crests and Latin phrases in the underground vault beneath a centuries-old church, the space accessible only through a series of hidden passages that had protected Savona secrets through world wars, prohibition, and generations of blood feuds that shaped the city above. Moisture glistened on ancient masonry as Tasha descended the final steps, her hospital scrubs replaced with simple black clothing that somehow conveyed more authority than any formal gown could have. Her decision to temporarily accept her birthright evident in her straightened spine and raised chin despite the conflict still visible in eyes that had witnessed her son's condition deteriorate further, while experimental treatment authorizations remained tangled in bureaucratic red tape that only Savona resources could cut through. Donna Elisa stood beside a stone altar where family artifacts gleamed in the unsteady light, centuries of history concentrated in delicate gold filigree and inscribed silver passed from generation to generation, waiting now for the heir whose existence had been hidden, even from herself, until necessity forced revelation. The ceremony proceeded without verbal instruction, Tasha somehow knowing exactly where to stand and which ancient words to speak as if the knowledge had always resided in muscle memory, waiting for activation, her voice growing stronger with each phrase of the oath that emphasized protection over conquest, responsibility over privilege, and justice over vengeance. 20 loyal soldiers knelt in perfect formation as Marco presented the signet ring on a velvet cushion, the intricate design matching exactly the tattoo spiraling up her arm, the physical manifestation of her inheritance designed to complete the circuit of power that had been interrupted by violence 20 years before. Hesitation flickered across her features as she accepted the heavy gold band, understanding that this moment represented not just access to resources needed for her son's treatment, but acknowledgement of a legacy she had never sought. The weight of responsibility for hundreds of families who relied on Savona protection settling onto shoulders accustomed only to carrying serving trays and medical bills. The ring slid onto her finger with surprising warmth, fitting perfectly against skin that had never worn jewelry more valuable than stainless steel. The connection between tattoo and signet creating a visual completion that resonated through the ancient chamber as loyal soldiers bowed their heads deeper in recognition of authority now properly invested. Light caught the engraved pattern as Tasha raised her hand in the traditional gesture of acceptance, her internal voice fiercely reminding herself that this was temporary, a necessary compromise to save Eli and protect vulnerable residents of neighborhoods where Vito's retribution would fall heaviest. Not the embracing of criminal enterprise, but the assumption of shield rather than sword. Her boundaries clearly established even as she accessed the power flowing through bloodlines and loyalty. The waitress who had endured a spilled water pitcher with humiliated silence now commanding resources capable of redirecting rivers while never forgetting the thirst of those who had nothing. Computer screens bathed the penthouse library in blue light as Tasha transformed the elegant space into a command center. Sullivan's meticulously organized evidence, spread across antique tables, where Ming vases had been unceremoniously relocated to make room for financial flowcharts and surveillance photographs linking Vito to decades of corruption. The skills that had once allowed her to memorize complex orders without writing them down now enabled her to track labyrinthine money trails through shell companies and offshore accounts. Her Waitress notepad replaced with sophisticated financial software, but her methodical approach unchanged as she documented every transaction with the same precision she had once applied to breakfast specials and coffee refills. Loyal Savona accountants worked alongside former FBI contacts Sullivan had maintained through his illness. The unusual alliance strengthened by Tasha's insistence that their objective was justice rather than territorial acquisition. Her authority evident in how she redirected suggestions of violence toward legal remedies that would permanently remove Vito's power rather than merely transferring it to another family. Reign continued its cleansing assault on the city as judges who had once been untouchable found themselves facing sudden ethics investigations based on anonymously provided evidence. Building inspectors discovered their bribery schemes exposed through financial records that appeared mysteriously on regulatory desks. And health department officials scrambled to explain licensing irregularities at Vito-owned nursing homes where elderly residents had suffered neglect while Medicare funds disappeared into private accounts. The constant keyboard clicking matched the determination in Tasha's eyes as she systematically bypassed traditional power structures that had failed her community, using Savona resources to file class action lawsuits on behalf of overcharged tenants, to establish emergency medical funds for families denied insurance coverage through Vito's interference, and to create legal aid clinics in neighborhoods where residents had previously suffered without recourse. Each victory small but meaningful to people whose struggles she understood intimately from years of serving their morning coffee and listening to their daily battles. Donna Elisa observed from the doorway as her granddaughter authorized wire transfers to cover experimental treatments, not just for Eli, but for 7 other children with similar conditions, the older woman noting with approval how Tasha instinctively balanced necessary force with measured restraint, leveraging power without becoming intoxicated by it, utilizing Savona connections to freeze Vito's assets through legitimate banking regulations rather than threats or violence. The mounting victories accumulated like raindrops forming a cleansing flood as federal agencies found themselves presented with comprehensive evidence packages addressing crimes they had long suspected but could never prove, each revelation creating another crack in Vito's protection network until his empire began crumbling not through bloodshed, but through the systematic application of justice guided by someone who understood the true cost of corruption from having personally paid its price throughout her life, her transformation from server to leader now complete in purpose if not in self-perception as she continued working through the night, determined to finish what Sullivan had started and her parents had died for. The text message arrived precisely as Tasha finalized documentation for federal prosecutors, a single image of Eli unconscious and connected to portable medical equipment, his hospital bed now located in a cavernous space with shattered windows visible in the background, coordinates attached without additional comment, a desperate gambit from a man watching his empire disintegrate hour by hour. Rain pounded against the abandoned waterfront warehouse with apocalyptic fury as Tasha approached, alone, despite Marcos' vehement objections, her decision not tactical but maternal, instinct telling her that additional forces would only escalate the danger to her son, whose life hung by increasingly fragile threads without proper medical supervision. Water cascaded through broken skylights and pooled across concrete floors as she moved through rusting machinery toward the makeshift medical station illuminated by portable generators, Vito standing beside her unconscious child with the hollow confidence of a man who had already lost everything except the ability to inflict final pain on his enemies. Lightning strobed through fractured windows as Vito began speaking, his words pouring forth not as negotiation, but confession. Decades of festering resentment finally finding voice as he revealed the truth she had suspected since learning her heritage. How her mother Catherine had been promised to him through family arrangements. How her beauty and sophistication would have elevated his status beyond mere criminal to aristocracy. How her rejection for Antonio Savona had destroyed not just business plans but his pride, transforming wounded vanity into obsessive hatred. Thunder punctuated his increasingly unhinged monologue as rain soaked them both, his expensive suit now as bedraggled as his crumbling composure while he detailed watching their apartment burn, his voice catching on descriptions of her mother's final moments with a possessiveness that suggested he considered her death preferable to her happiness with another man. Rainwater mixed with tears on Tasha's cheeks as she finally confronted the architect of her lifelong struggles, the man whose wounded ego had orphaned her, whose insecurity had kept her in poverty, and whose entitlement now threatened her child, his twisted logic, revealing how thoroughly he believed himself justified in punishing a woman for exercising choice and her family for existing as evidence of that choice. Lightning illuminated Vito's contorted features, decades of carefully maintained public persona stripped away to reveal the insecure boy beneath the Mafia Don, his eyes wild with the recognition that his destruction came not from rival families or federal agents, but from the daughter of the woman who had denied him, the ultimate rejection now repeated through generations as Tasha stood before him, not broken by his actions but strengthened through them, her very existence the living proof that his violence had failed to erase what he could not possess. The calculated smile spreading across Tasha's face silenced Vito's confession mid-sentence, confusion replacing rage as she calmly withdrew her phone and turned the screen toward him, the live video feed showing Eli already safely installed in a private medical suite across the city, Marco visible beside the properly monitored bed where specialists administered the experimental treatment that had finally been authorized hours earlier. Realization dawned in Vito's eyes as she explained how she had anticipated his desperation, how the hospital bed contained a sophisticated medical dummy with monitors programmed to simulate her son's vital signs, how she had allowed him this final move to draw him away from remaining allies and into this isolated confrontation, the careful planning revealing strategic foresight that honored her Savona heritage, while the concern for her son's safety reflected her years as a protective mother. Lightning flashed again as Vito processed the complete collapse of his final leverage, his face transitioning through disbelief and humiliation before settling into feral desperation. The switchblade appearing in his hand with practiced speed as he lunged toward Tasha with killing intent, the blade arcing through humid air toward her throat with all his remaining strength and skill. Time seemed to crystallize into perfect clarity as Tasha's body responded with movements she had never consciously learned, her waitress reflexes enhanced by genetic memory as she sidestepped the initial thrust with fluid precision, her left arm deflecting his wrist while her right hand simultaneously struck his elbow with calculated force, the years of balancing heavy trays having built unexpected strength in seemingly delicate wrists. Rain continued its rhythmic assault as she moved with surprising grace for someone who had never trained in combat, each defensive motion flowing into the next as if following choreography written in her cells, her body remembering what her mind had never been taught through bloodlines that had survived centuries of conflict. The knife clattered against concrete as Vito found himself suddenly disarmed and immobilized. Tasha's forearm pressed against his throat with just enough pressure to demonstrate control without crushing, his windpipe, his wide eyes reflecting recognition that the power to end his life rested with the daughter of those he had murdered. The ultimate vulnerability now is as armed Savona soldiers emerged from shadows with weapons trained on his vital organs, awaiting the single word or gesture from Tasha that would deliver final justice. Thunder echoed through the cavernous space as she maintained pressure for 3 heartbeats, long enough to acknowledge the choice before her, to feel the temptation of vengeance pulsing through veins that carried generations of retribution, the collective weight of family history urging completion of a cycle begun decades before her birth. Vito closed his eyes in anticipation of death, but instead felt her arm withdraw as Tasha stepped back, her voice calm as she ordered her men to secure him for federal authorities rather than dispose of his body in the convenient harbour waters just outside, her choice affirming that while she had accessed her hereditary power and physical capabilities, she would not embrace the darkness that had consumed both families, through endless cycles of violence. Her restraint demonstrating not weakness but the true strength her mother had recognized in choosing love over arranged power all those years ago. Handcuffs clinked with cold finality as federal agents secured Vito beneath the warehouse awning, rain continuing to fall in the sheets that transformed flashing blue lights into watery halos, reflecting across growing puddles in the cracked parking lot. Sullivan stood beneath an umbrella supported by his aluminum walker, vindication radiating from his frail form as he watched the man who had poisoned him and destroyed his career, finally facing consequences through the justice system he had devoted his life to upholding, years of meticulously gathered evidence now complemented by direct attempted murder charges from the warehouse confrontation that would ensure maximum sentencing without possibility of early release. Tasha observed the scene from beneath the shelter of Marcos' umbrella, her decision to choose legal justice over personal vengeance, having surprised even herself, the weight of generational violence suddenly lifted from her shoulders as she refused to perpetuate cycles that had defined both families for centuries. Her strength demonstrated not through bloodshed, but through the harder choice of allowing impartial systems to deliver appropriate punishment. Water streamed down Vito's defeated face as agents guided him toward waiting vehicles, his empire dismantled, his protection network exposed, and his freedom permanently revoked. Justice serving as a more complete destruction than quick death could have provided, the systematic dismantling of everything he had built, ensuring his legacy would be erased more thoroughly than his physical existence would have been. Donna Elisa appeared silently beside Tasha, disappointment evident in the tight line of her lips and the subtle disapproval radiating from her rigid posture. Generations of Savona tradition expecting blood repayment for blood taken, her fingers unconsciously touching the gold locket containing photographs of her murdered son and daughter-in-law as she witnessed their killer escorted to face merely human justice rather than family retribution. Yet beneath her initial disappointment flickered unexpected respect as she recognized the courage required for Tasha to defy not just family expectation, but the temptation of personal vengeance, the independence of mind that refused blind adherence to tradition while still honoring the protective principles at its core. Perhaps the first true evolution of Savona power in centuries that might finally break chains of violence that had ultimately served neither family well. Sirens wailed as the federal caravan departed with their high-value prisoner Sullivan, following in a separate vehicle with evidence files securely transported. The legal machinery now in motion without further need for Savona intervention, allowing Tasha to refocus completely on her son's treatment and recovery without the shadow of pending violence darkening their future. Rain gradually subsided as Tasha and her grandmother stood in momentary silence. The absence of words containing multitudes of understanding between women, separated by generations but united by blood and choice. The foundation of a new legacy taking shape between them that honored tradition while transforming its application, justice without unnecessary brutality, creating possibilities neither family had previously imagined possible in their long and tangled history. Sunlight streamed through spotless windows of the transformed Bluebird Community Center, the former diner now unrecognizable after extensive renovations that replaced flickering fluorescents with warm recessed lighting, yellowed linoleum with polished hardwood, and cracked vinyl booths with comfortable modular seating that could be rearranged for neighborhood meetings, after-school programs, or medical outreach services depending on daily needs. 3 months had passed since Vito Caruso began serving his life sentence without possibility of parole, his trial having revealed corruption extensive enough to trigger investigations across multiple city departments, each revelation creating opportunities for positive change that Tasha implemented through newly established legitimate Savona enterprises focusing on affordable housing development, small business loans, and infrastructure improvements in long-neglected neighborhoods. The Savona Medical Research Foundation occupied the gleaming upper floors of what had previously been shell corporations for money laundering, its laboratories now stuffed by specialists developing treatments for rare blood disorders using the breakthrough therapy that had saved Eli, whose rosy cheeks and boundless energy as he helped distribute muffins to elderly visitors bore no resemblance to the fragile boy who had nearly died in that hospital bed. Donna Elisa watched from her corner table with grudging admiration as Tasha moved comfortably between corporate boardrooms and community service, her granddaughter having maintained the protective essence of Savona tradition while stripping away criminal elements, transforming underground networks into transparent community organizations with visible boards of directors and public financial statements reviewed quarterly by independent auditors. Sullivan, health improving after specialized treatment funded through the foundation, advised the legal compliance team in ensuring every business operation withstood scrutiny while creating sustainable employment for community members previously trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. Morning light cast hopeful patterns across the community center floor where Marco now directed security for legitimate enterprises with the same loyalty he had once shown to criminal operations, his formidable skills redirected toward protecting neighborhood safety programs and youth mentorship initiatives rather than enforcing territorial claims through intimidation and violence. Tasha moved through the bustling space with easy confidence, occasionally stepping behind the counter to personally serve coffee with the practiced efficiency of her waitress days. This voluntary service, a conscious reminder of her origins and connection to working people whose daily struggles she refused to forget despite the exponential growth of resources now under her direction. Financial ledgers open on public computers replaced hidden accounting books, construction permits displayed prominently replaced bribes for code violations, and scholarship announcements replaced protection racket schedules on community bulletin boards where sunlight illuminated opportunities rather than shadows concealing threats. Children laughed freely in the tutoring corner where Eli received help catching up on schoolwork missed during his illness, their voices creating a soundtrack of possibility that accompanied Tasha as she carried coffee to a young mother struggling with medical bills, pressing a foundation application into her hand with the understanding born from having stood in identical shoes, the transformation of personal suffering into community healing, completing a cycle broken and reformed through conscious choice rather than destructive vengeance. Maximum security glass separated Tasha from the diminished figure in orange prison scrubs, Vito Caruso barely recognizable after 6 months of incarceration, his once commanding presence withered by the harsh fluorescent lighting and rigid routines that now governed his existence in place of the empire he had built and lost. Guards monitored their interaction with careful attention as Tasha placed a small velvet box in the transfer drawer, watching without satisfaction as confusion flickered across Vito's sunken features when he opened it to discover his own family signet ring, the symbol of power and lineage he had retrieved from federal evidence once its documentation was complete. No words passed between them as understanding dawned in his eyes, the voluntary return of his family heritage communicating more clearly than any speech could have her conscious decision to break cycles of vengeance and possession that had destroyed both their families across generations, the small act of mercy carrying no forgiveness for his crimes but refusing to perpetuate patterns that would bind future generations to past hatreds. Tasha rose without waiting for response, having delivered everything she came to communicate through the simple act of relinquishing what many would have destroyed out of justified resentment, her back straight as she walked away from the visiting room without looking back at the man who had shaped so much of her suffering, yet could no longer touch her future or her sons. Spring sunshine enveloped her as she exited the prison complex, the light so different from the rain that had fallen during their warehouse confrontation, nature itself seeming to acknowledge the completion of transformation as she moved toward the waiting car where Eli bounced impatiently in the back seat, his medical monitoring devices replaced by colourful wristbands from the science camp he attended through the foundation, his future now measured in possibilities rather than limitations. Every life contains moments that can alter its entire trajectory, small acts of cruelty or courage that ripple outward to touch countless others, creating patterns that eventually return to their source transformed by the journey. Each choice we make inscribing itself upon our souls as surely as Tasha's tattoo marked her skin, invisible until circumstance reveals what truly lies beneath the surface. The mockery of a waitress in a rundown diner triggered a cascade that toppled an empire built on decades of corruption. A small kindness to an elderly customer provided the key to justice that legal systems had failed to deliver, and the decision to return a symbol rather than destroy it planted seeds of possible redemption in soil long poisoned by hatred. What marks do you carry beneath your everyday existence? What pattern waits to be recognized in the moment of your greatest challenge or deepest compassion? What power for transformation lies dormant in your veins until the precise alignment of choice and circumstance calls it forth to forever alter not just your life but the lives of everyone you touch with either casual cruelty or unexpected mercy?